In this week's story, a simple walk in a town marks the beginning of a descent into months of terror. Stay tuned till the end, because right at the end there's a twist. Maybe you can see it coming, and maybe you can't. Several factors conspired to create Cara's day of terror, but it was only possible to understand this in retrospect, with the full benefit of hindsight. A detective, versed in the relevant arts, could have pieced it all together afterwards, but few would have predicted it. It was already 9 in the evening when she finally arrived at her hotel. The hotel was on a long street of grey stone buildings, quite close to the coast. The door opened onto a corridor which, after 4 red carpeted steps, led to a reception desk. There was a bit of a mix-up at the desk due to the man asking for documents and Cara not understanding what documents he wanted, but finally she understood that he wanted to see her passport. "Your first visit to Trieste," he said, smiling professionally. "Yes, actually," she said. "I'm here to review a new art gallery." He smiled again, slightly less warmly than the previous time, and said, "Bene." She wasn't sure if he'd understood. He busied himself with photocopying her passport. "Room 452, he said, when the formalities were completed. "The elevator is on the left." The room was surprisingly large, complete with facilities for making tea and a desk. She was exhausted after the long journey and the even longer wait in the airport due to the delay, but she phoned Robert anyway, as they had arranged. "I've finally arrived," she said, when he answered. "At last," he said. "Did you manage to get anything to eat in the end?" "I bought a calzone on the plane, but it was absolutely disgusting," she said. "I couldn't eat it. I had to hide it in my coffee cup." "Maybe the hotel still has food. Italians eat late." "I'll check in a minute," she said. "What's the weather like there?" "It's warm." She felt oddly irritated. In theory she loved Robert, but at times like these she felt no actual love, only a cold desire to be left alone with her thoughts. "I hope you can sleep tonight," he said. She sensed he was distracted, busy with something, probably balancing the phone under his chin. "I'm sure I will," she said. "I'm tired. I'm going to go now, I'm so hungry." "Oh, okay. Good luck for tomorrow, Cara. Love you." "Bye," she said, and she ended the call. She lay back on the hotel bed, which was covered in a velvety patterned red sheet, underneath which was a blanket. She wondered vaguely if they ever washed the sheet. It smelt old. Her stomach rumbled. She felt like hiding her face from the world. The day had just been too much. She decided to make herself an instant coffee, in the hope the caffeine would give her enough energy to go and inquire about food. When she finally made it back down to the reception, the man informed her the kitchen had closed. She purchased a bag of crisps from the vending machine and ate them joylessly in her room. Then she attempted to sleep. She couldn't manage it. It was as though she had forgotten how to do it. Sleep seemed an alien concept, lacking in meaning. She found herself thinking about her boss, Leo. Something was off about him recently. Why had he really sent her to Italy? Did he want her out of the way for some reason? But why, if so? She had only just managed to nod off when the alarm rang. It was morning. The gallery was on a street adjacent to the historic centre. She found the centre easily, since the hotel was virtually in the centre already, and there she sat down on a table outside a cafe and ordered a brioche and a cappuccino. From her laptop bag, she removed her mobile phone and cigarettes. The old centre of Trieste was full of sandy-coloured Germanic buildings, but less tall and less Germanic than in the surrounding area. Once, when James Joyce had patronised the bars there, the area had been seedy, run down and full of brothels, but now it was the very epicentre of fashionable cafes and wine bars. The gallery owner and local artist had agreed to meet her before the gallery opened to the public at 9 a.m. She would get to see it before even most local journalists. After finishing her coffee, she carefully consulted a map on her phone and headed off in the direction of Trieste's less salubrious regions. Eventually, after a long walk uphill, she found the gallery on a street that divided the historic centre from a cheaper area full of large apartment blocks. The owner calmly opened the door and greeted her in English. "I'm honoured that your prestigious magazine should have taken such an interest in my humble gallery," he said. He was dressed in dark blue velvety corduroy trousers, a black t-shirt and an achingly fashionable sports jacket. A blue velvet scarf was tied around his neck. His face wore a delicately trimmed black goatee, and his hair was swept impressively back and held in place with hair cream. All in all, she had never seen anything quite like him. He looked, she thought, like an artist's interpretation of Satan in modern form. "You've made quite a stir," she said with a forced smile. "We consider you one of the most exciting rising stars of the art world." "Very kind," he said. "So the gallery is mainly devoted to your own art?" she asked, casting a glance around the rather shocking collection of paintings. "2/3 of it is my own work," he said. "The other third consists of selected paintings, mainly from Italy and the Balkans, that I happen to find interesting." Her attention was drawn by the largest painting visible from the entrance. It depicted an enormous rat feasting on the head of a small child dressed in a suit. It was carefully signed in the corner, Aurelio Scarafaggio. "Ah, this of course is one of my best known works," he said. She was used to shocking artworks, but somehow this one gave her the creeps. In Holland she had reviewed an artist who largely painted birds with their innards emerging from maggot-infested bodies, and in Berlin she had written a piece on a gallery full of nudes engaged in obscene acts while surrounded by blood and gore. But somehow Scarafaggio's work struck her as depraved on a whole new level. "It represents modernity feasting on the corpse of an older and more elegant age," she said. It was half question, half statement. "Precisely," he said, "as does all my work, in one way or another." His eyes glittered as he admired his own painting. Some unholy emotion seemed to run through his body, as if he drew energy from the painting. "But doesn't your own work contribute in a small way to the destruction of older social mores?" she said. "Isn't your work itself feasting on the corpse of antiquity?" He laughed. "Of course," he said. "But I'm being rude. May I offer you a coffee, or perhaps an apéritif?" "I would like to see the gallery first," she said. "And then I would like to ask you some biographical questions for the article." For an hour they toured the small gallery. Every painting was uniquely unsettling in its own way. Every single painting depicted blood, gore, obscenity, depravity. For the first time in her life, her reaction to the art surprised her. She felt angry. Was it right that this temple to perversity should exist, when so many talented artists struggled to find patronage simply because they depicted only what was beautiful? Scarafaggio seemed to only draw strength from the endless depictions of suffering and disease. Fortunately, he appeared not to sense her mood. After touring the gallery, she allowed him to prepare coffee, and for almost an hour she interrogated him about his life, his motivations, his experience of the art world. All of his answers were oddly unsettling. For example, his parents had died from accidental poisoning when he was 13 years old, but he claimed not to remember that period of his life at all. "You don't think the experience of your parents' deaths has influenced your art?" she said. Her mouth was unexpectedly dry. She almost dreaded the answer. "Perhaps subconsciously," he said, staring at her intently. My art explores and interrogates suffering and ultimately elucidates it. It is nothing, if not an exploration of death and despair. I seek to cast light where light should not be cast, and thereby to bring darkness to the light. Finally she escaped into the warm sunlight around 10, nauseous and unsettled. She began to walk back down the hill towards the hotel, but her disturbed mood failed to lift, and she decided instead to try to walk it off. The thought of sitting and working in the gloomy hotel room was unbearable. She began to walk without any destination in mind, determined to repair her mood via vigorous exposure to air and sunlight. The quiet back street of the gallery gave way to busy main arteries, and by 11 she had spent an hour walking along one noisy traffic-cursed thoroughfare after another. Feeling thirsty and irritated, she happened to spot a bar. From somewhere in the depths of the bar came a strange blue light. She stopped and stared at it. It was oddly mesmerizing, so blue. Taking her attraction to the blueness as a sign, she stepped into the bar. The blue light came from a kind of neon decoration at the end, spelling out the word beer in English. Without turning to look at the bartender, she asked for a gin and tonic. Her nerves were still horribly jangly from Scarafaggio's horrible art. Still without turning, she absent-mindedly took the drink and drank half of it in one go. "Are you okay?" said the bartender in English. His accent wasn't quite Italian, perhaps Slovenian or Serbian, she thought. "What?" she said. "Are you okay?" he repeated. "You don't seem so well." Finally she turned to look at him. With a terrible start, she realised his lips were a mass of boils or warts. Instantly she felt sickened and disgusted. Then she inwardly reprimanded herself. He can't help it, she thought. Probably it's not infectious. But why work in a bar with such an affliction? Still, he's got to work somewhere. Just exhausted, she said, with an attempt at a smile. "You have to take care in the sun," said the man, "even in the morning. You English aren't used to it." "Not used to it," she repeated, absently. "You should be careful round here," he said. "There have been some attacks in this area recently." "Attacks?" she said. "A German woman, a tourist. She was horribly beaten." He was staring at her fixedly. "How awful," she said. She looked at her drink. There were clear marks of old lipstick around the top of the glass. "They destroyed her face," said the man. "Worthless animals. Probably it's not catching," she thought to herself again. With an inward shrug, she drained the rest of the glass. "How awful," she said again. "And me, I was attacked once," said the bartender. "Look." He lifted up his shirt to reveal a horrible mass of scars and scabs. "They threw something on me," he said. "I don't know what it was. Here, you can touch it." He tried to grab her hand. "Thank you," she said, quickly rising to her feet. She pulled out a €10 note with a shaky hand and flung it on the counter. "Don't you want your change?" said the man. But she was already half out of the door. She walked with renewed determination. If she kept walking, she must surely emerge from the town and hit the sea or trees, she thought. As she walked steeply uphill, she noticed the buildings seemed to become steadily uglier. Monstrous concrete brutalist buildings designed in experimental shapes and faceless concrete blocks. She took out her phone to check the map. It said she was still in the gallery. She pressed the icon to move the map marker to her current location, and at that moment the screen turned black. She gave a little sigh of frustration and stuffed the phone back in her bag. The road continued to lead her steeply uphill. As far as she could remember, eventually she should hit the line of trees at the top of Trieste. Then she should be able to follow them northwest, and then descend back towards the centre. Trees were what she needed, she thought. Some shade and friendly dog walkers. The buildings only continued to become more and more vile as she climbed higher and higher up towards the karst plateau. Some of them appeared deserted, blank staring windows and covered in strange mosses and runoff stains. She thought she saw an eyeless elderly man slumped against the side of a building in an inner courtyard, sunk black pits where his eyes should be. When her phone rang, she almost jumped out of her skin. She scrabbled frantically in her bag, looking for it. She found it and pressed the icon to answer the call. "Hello," she said. "Cara?" said the voice on the other end. "It's Leo. Where are you? Did you see the gallery?" "Yes, I saw it. I don't know where I am. I think I'm lost." "Lost?" said Leo. "In Trieste?" "Of course in Trieste. My phone's not working properly. I can't look at the map." There was a pause, then Leo said, "Do you see any street names near you? I'll check here." She looked around. "I can't see any, Leo." "Leo?" But Leo wasn't on the line anymore. She fumbled with the phone in an effort to make it work again and somehow managed to drop it. The phone seemed to fall to the ground in slow motion, and as she watched it fall, she felt as though her entire world was disappearing with the phone, all familiar points of reference retreating into the distance. The phone hit the ground with a resounding crack and the screen smashed. She began to peer closely at every building, looking for street names. Finally she found one. It said, Via Terra. She stared at it in surprise. What kind of name was that for a road? Was it a joke? Perhaps she thought it meant something, in Slovenian or Croatian. As she was gazing in wonder at the street sign, she felt something crawling on her ankle. A cockroach was making its way slowly up her leg. She yelped and shook it off. The street seemed to be quite full of them, crawling in the gutter, up the sides of buildings, and skittering across the pavement. She counted at least 10, large, ugly black insects, capable of moving at astonishing speeds, quite unlike anything she had seen even in London. She strode off up the hill, stuffing the remains of her phone into her bag, her heart pounding. A little bit further and I'll arrive at the trees or spot the sea, she told herself. As she climbed higher and higher, her ears popping, the cockroaches only seemed to multiply. The people she saw all seemed to suffer from terrifying deformities, or else their faces were fixed into aggressive snarls or blank masks. She couldn't even find one person from whom she felt comfortable asking directions. In rapid succession, she saw a man with half his face missing, a boy with putrid black teeth and blood dribbling from his mouth, and an elderly woman with a wizened, jaundiced face, apparently engaged in beating a dog that snarled at her and seemed on the verge of attacking her. She contemplated turning around and retracing her steps, but surely by now she must be nearing the end of this awful district. There could only be so much of it. The next street name she spotted was Via del Tortura, Street of Torture. Soon afterwards she found a side street named Via della Morte. Didn't that mean Street of Death? It was then that she began to suspect she was the victim of some kind of sick joke. It was impossible that the streets could have such horrible names. It was impossible that there could be so many diseased people in one small area. But who could possibly play such a joke on her? Who would go to such lengths? Scarafaggio? Had he realised she found his art disgusting and decided to take revenge? She couldn't imagine how he could have engineered such a bizarre and elaborate punishment, although the idea did make a kind of sense, she thought. "You're a foreigner," said a voice. She turned to see a man whose head seemed almost split down the middle. In a flash of horror, she recalled an article she had read 2 years previously. Sometimes babies were born with enormous splits down the middles of their faces, even exposing their malformed brains. The article said doctors quietly killed them and no one ever objected, not even their traumatized mothers. But now, fear washed over her in a cold, icy wave. She couldn't control it. She began to half walk, half jog away from the man. "We don't like foreigners," said the man. By now, half the buildings were little more than ruins, and cockroaches covered the road, fighting each other over scraps of food. She saw no cars, but at least the road had levelled and she was no longer ascending. She passed another side road, this time labelled in English, "You will suffer." She felt sick. She shouted "Stop," but no one replied. Surely this couldn't only be Scarafaggio's work. Could Leo be involved somehow? Why had he really sent her to Trieste? Did they want to drive her mad? What if the whole area had been abandoned and they had skillfully turned it into a kind of loathsome art installation designed to destroy her mind? Had they somehow manipulated her into walking to this exact spot? Up ahead she spotted something moving behind an odd concrete brutalist buttress that stuck out from the side of a building. She froze and watched it. A teenager with a face covered in greenish scabs peeked out from behind it. He was holding something, some small container of liquid. Why was he behaving like that? She remembered the man in the bar. "They threw something on me," he had said. Did the boy mean to hurl some corrosive liquid at her and rob her? No, she told herself, I'm being paranoid now. She thought she could make out the logo of some drinks company on the little container. He was just a teenager with a can of fizzy drink, nothing more. She forced herself to walk onward. As she neared the boy, he peeked out from behind the buttress again. Her heart was in her mouth, but she forced herself to keep walking. Just a harmless teenager with an unfortunate skin condition. Nothing more than that. She had almost passed him when suddenly he jumped out at her, holding the can of liquid aloft. She hit him in the face as hard as she could with her bag. The bag wasn't thick, and by sheer luck the edge of the laptop computer caught him on the bridge of the nose with a satisfying smack. He shouted in pain, and she ran. She wasn't sure how long she had been running for when she first saw the men, 2 of them in military uniforms of some kind, watching her from the entrance of some grotesque, dilapidated official building, set back from the street. The uniforms didn't look familiar at all. Was it possible that she had strayed into Slovenia? She had run half marathons back in London, and by sheer good luck, she was wearing soft flat shoes and not heels. She tried to think how far the Slovenian border was from Trieste. It was close, she knew that. It was possible that she had crossed it, she thought. The men were watching her intently. One of them picked up a radio and spoke some words into it. She forced herself to keep running, gasping for breath. Large gaps were beginning to appear between ruined buildings. Diseased, malformed trees stood in the gaps, often covered with ants and fungus. Sometimes she passed odd, metal-roofed shacks covered in obscene graffiti in English, Italian, and other languages that she didn't recognise. After passing a ruined building, hardly more than some fragments of wall, where a mangy dog licked a crawling, crying baby as an armless woman looked on in apparent satisfaction, she arrived at a fence, sealing off the end of the road. Beyond was only thick forest. She fell against the fence, sobbing and screaming. The fence was topped with barbed wire, and the foot of it was buried in the ground. Then she heard a shout, and she turned to see 3 uniformed men approaching. "Wait," shouted one of the men. "We won't hurt you." Their uniforms were filthy and tattered, and they were carrying rifles. "Leave me alone," she screamed. "We're here to help you," shouted the man, and the other 2, burst into horrible peals of sardonic laughter. Desperately, she looked for an escape route. She noticed there was a tear in the fence, a little over to the right. It might be big enough to get through. She ran to it and began prizing the fence apart. "Hey," shouted the man, "you can't go in there, it's not safe." "We want to help you," shouted another of the men. She tore at the fence frantically and began to try to get her head and shoulders through the gap. The loose, rusty wire ends cut into her face where the strands had been severed. "Stop," shouted one of the men as they broke into a run. The gap in the fence wasn't quite wide enough, but she had managed to get her head and shoulders and one arm through when she spotted the dog. It was standing watching her on the other side of the fence, its teeth bared in a snarl. The dog looked large and powerful, and it was covered in scabs and seemed half crazed. She froze. The men were almost on her. She had to take her chances either with the dog or the men. She chose the dog and continued to try to struggle through the fence, but the men were too quick. They grabbed her and pulled her back, the fence scratching her forehead painfully. She noticed a rusty old van trundling towards her, belching out diesel fumes. "Get off me," she shouted. "I'm a British citizen. You'll pay for this." The men laughed and dragged her towards the van. She tried to hit them. She dropped her bag and one of them picked it up. Another of the men produced a pair of handcuffs. "No," she shouted, "no!" But they were too strong. They handcuffed her and threw her in the back of the van. One of them got in the back with her, the other two sitting in the front seats. The back of the van smelt of feces, and she counted at least 6 cockroaches sitting in various positions on the floor, the sides and the roof. One of them crawled on the man's legs, traversing a bare patch in his tattered army uniform. "Do not worry," he said in halting English. "We're going to sort you out." When the van finally stopped and they bundled her out, she found herself at the back of an imposing building. Some kind of military headquarters, she thought. She was taken through corridors of uniformed men and women, some of them resembling military personnel, others more resembling doctors or nurses. After taking her up in a lift, they threw her in a cell on some upper floor, removed her handcuffs and left her there. They had taken her bag. She couldn't even try to use her broken phone to call for help. "Help," she screamed, "help me." The cell was somewhat dark and the walls bare and stained. A filthy bed at the side was covered in some foreign species of insect, like a cross between ants and spiders, with bright green little patches on their backs. After perhaps an hour, the door opened. She flung herself at the man who appeared. "Help me," she said. "I'm British. I shouldn't be here." He was wearing a white lab coat and looked like a scientist. Behind him were 2 men in blue overalls. "Hold her," said the man, and he produced a hypodermic syringe. "No," she said in horror. "I don't consent. Get off me." They held her and the man injected her. "You'll feel better soon," he said, with a smile that half resembled a snarl. She felt her thoughts slowing and receding. They put her on the filthy bed and left her there. An insect crawled over her forehead, but she didn't have the energy to move. She felt something tickling her hand. She held it in front of her face and saw an insect burrowing into her skin. She screamed. When she awoke, it was dark. She lay there, strangely calm. The insects at least seemed to have diminished. Who would do this to her? Leo? Scarafaggio? Then, with a horrible sense of dawning conviction, she thought of Robert. He had seemed off recently. He must be in on this. Was he having an affair? Did he want her out the way? She burst into tears. Eventually she fell asleep again. In the morning, 2 female nurses turned up together with the scientist, and they brought her food and pills. "Take these," said the scientist. "Let me out," she said. "Let me out of here." "Please take the pills," said the scientist. "Who are you people? What do you want with me?" "I am Dr. Marconi," said the scientist. "Cara, you've suffered a psychotic break. These pills will help you feel normal again. Your husband is on the way here." "I'm not psychotic," she said. "You attacked a boy," said Dr. Marconi. "You were screaming. Your boss contacted the police. He said you sounded insane." So it was all true, she thought. Robert, Leo, and no doubt Scarafaggio were conspiring against her. She had been feeling weird. Scarafaggio had given her a coffee. It must have been poisoned. She recalled the ghastly look on his face as he had watched her drinking it. A sly thought occurred to her. She took the pills and put them underneath her tongue. "Drink this, please," said Dr. Marconi, and one of the nurses handed her a glass of water. She drank it thirstily. "Open your mouth, please," said the doctor. She panicked. He would see the 2 pills underneath her tongue. She shook her head. "Mm-mm," she said. "Cara, you must swallow the pills or we will have to inject you." Maybe she could make herself sick afterwards, she thought. Reluctantly, she swallowed them. "I need a bathroom," she said. "Okay," said the doctor. They took her to a lavatory where she stuck her fingers down her throat and tried to throw up the pills as quietly as possible, but they overheard her and dragged her out of the cubicle before she could manage it. The next day, they took her to a quiet room decorated with 2 lackluster potted plants, and Robert appeared. She burst into tears. "Why are you doing this to me?" she said, crying. "Cara, you're paranoid," he said gently. "The doctors say you suffered a kind of breakdown. You need to try to get better." "When can we go home?" she said, thinking surely a long journey would offer a chance to escape. "Soon," he said. "First you need to calm down. You're too ill for them to transport you anywhere." "You're having an affair," she said, becoming suddenly angry. "I know about it. You're working with Leo. You arranged everything with that awful charlatan, that so-called artist." "No, Cara," he said sadly. But she could see through him. He couldn't keep the vindictive sarcasm out of his voice. She flung herself at him, hitting his face. "You," she screamed, "you're doing this to me." 2 male nurses appeared and began to drag her off. "Help me," she shouted. "Help me, Robert." Robert covered his face in his hands. The weeks passed slowly. She felt as though she was in a state between waking and sleeping. Eventually she was summoned to a room where Dr. Marconi sat waiting for her. "Can you tell me your name?" he said. "Cara Levitt," she said dully. "Do you know why you're here, Cara?" said the doctor. "I was kidnapped," she said. 3 men grabbed me on the street. Military people, from Slovenia, I think." The doctor scribbled something on a notepad. "Those men were Italian police," said the doctor. "No," she said. "They were wearing filthy old military uniforms." "Cara," said the doctor patiently, "I'm going to tell you something. I want you to consider it. You don't have to believe me, but I want you to think about it." "What?" she said. Was he about to confess the entire plot, she wondered. "Cara," said the doctor again, using her first name as though he was some old friend of hers, she noted. "You suffered a psychotic break. A temporary break with reality. You may have seen things that weren't real, and you will certainly have misinterpreted much of what has gone on. Your husband, Robert, is here in Trieste. He has called in every day to see you, but sometimes you've been sleeping." She was about to object, but a plan formed in her sleepy, drugged brain. Play along, she thought. There's more chance of escaping if they think she believes him. What would cause such a thing, she said. Well, said the doctor, no one knows. You're 27 years old. That's about the age when psychosis is most likely to occur in women. In men it tends to happen a little younger. Your husband tells me you weren't sleeping well and you were under some stress. Lack of sleep and stress can contribute to the progression of symptoms, although these things can also be symptoms in themselves. You may have experienced insomnia, anxiety, paranoia, voices that seem real but aren't real. So what's my diagnosis, doctor? She said, unable to fully contain her sarcasm. What illness do you think I'm suffering from? Healthy people don't just go psychotic. Paranoid schizophrenia, said the doctor. It's actually very common. 1 in 100 people suffer from it. And how long do you plan to keep me here? She said. Not long, I think, said the doctor. You already seem much calmer. There is every chance the medication will work. It's important that you try to sleep and don't worry about things. She nodded and forced a smile. Somehow Robert and Leo must have convinced this doctor she was insane. Fine, then she would pretend to be in recovery. Then they would have to take her home, and then she would escape and find people she could trust. Robert turned up the next day. Of course he stuck to the same line as the doctor. Cara, he said, the doctor's telling me signs are good. He says 2/3 of people who have this condition are able to live at home, and 1/3 recover completely. He thinks you might make a full recovery. Isn't that good? That's great, Robert, she said coldly. I already feel much better. They moved her to a nicer room. She could look through a wire-covered window at a lawn outside, where other patients played with cats. Somewhere a bird was singing to itself. Robert continued to visit. She was starting to think he was genuinely upset. How could he be having an affair when he was spending all his time in Italy, visiting her every day? He was talking to her quietly and patiently one day, when the conviction struck her that he, at least, was genuine. She flung herself into his arms, sobbing pitifully. "Oh, Robert," she said, "I'm sorry." "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said. "It's just an illness." Gradually she formulated a new theory. Robert wasn't in on it. Leo probably wasn't in on it. Scarafaggio had poisoned her. That was the most likely possibility. It was not until several months later, when she was at home in England, that it occurred to her that Scarafaggio probably hadn't poisoned her either. She had developed an illness, and that was all there was to it. She felt ridiculous and ashamed, but Robert pointed out that schizophrenia is no more something to be ashamed of than diabetes or a broken leg. These things just happen sometimes, he said. The important thing is you're getting better all the time. You know, he said, laughing, I retraced the route you probably took in Trieste. It's not the nicest part of Trieste, but it's really not awful either. Nice town, actually, Trieste. Her own doctor switched her medication to something he thought would make her less tired, and it seemed to help. How long will I have to take these pills for? She asked him. Perhaps for your whole life, he said, but perhaps not. We need to see how it goes. The important thing is not to stop them suddenly. You see, these medications reduce the production of certain neurotransmitters, but your brain responds by becoming more sensitive to those neurotransmitters. If you stop the pills suddenly, you will likely suffer a relapse. Are you saying psychosis is one of the withdrawal effects of this medication? Said Cara. The doctor gave a hollow little laugh. You could put it like that, he said, adding, unfortunately. But look at it this way. These pills with all their side effects are a lot better than being out of touch with reality. Cara was able to return to work 6 months later. After a year, Her doctor suggested they tail off the medication, and by the time 2 years had passed since that awful day in Trieste, she was off it completely. "You're very lucky," her doctor said with a smile. "Only a third of people who experience a psychotic break recover from it completely." "Go ahead," she said, pointing at a girl in the audience who had patiently put up her hand for the third time. "First, let me say I absolutely loved your book," said the girl. "Thank you so much," said Cara. "I know it takes real bravery to talk about mental illness so frankly. I couldn't put the book down. I read it all the way through in one day. It was incredible." The audience laughed appreciatively. Cara could see 2 or 3 people nodding in agreement. "I was just wondering if you're aware that a bar owner in Trieste was convicted of murdering a woman recently. The bar sounded a lot like the one you describe in the book. They say he poisoned women with some kind of chemical that drove them insane before attacking them." "What?" said Cara. The girl repeated what she had just said in slightly different words, adding on a few more bits of information. A little ripple of conversation went around the audience. "What do you think about this?" said the girl. "Do you think you could have been poisoned?" Cara opened her mouth to speak, but no words emerged. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror and my name is John. All the stories on this channel are written by me. The initial inspiration for this story came from a walk I actually undertook in Trieste, where the buildings did seem to get uglier and uglier and started to assume brutalist forms. To me, brutalism has the same relation to ordinary ugliness in buildings that torture has to pain. Brutalism seems to be a conscious attempt to inflict suffering on people with sheer ugliness, but that's just my view of it. However, I must emphasise that Trieste itself is a beautiful town and it's actually very safe. Trieste used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and it's kind of round the corner in the top northeast corner of Italy. If you look at it, it looks like it almost should be part of another country, and indeed it used to be. The border with Slovenia is very close, and Slovenia is also, on the whole, a very nice country, I would say. I decided to set this story in Trieste really just because a walk in Trieste inspired it, and I am familiar with Trieste. Do join me again next week when I'll have another story ready for you. I have absolutely no idea what at the moment. Although, after hearing that the town of Nottingham has a huge number of caves underneath it, I have been thinking about setting a story in the caves underneath Nottingham. Many of them were actually only discovered quite recently, in the past few years. Anyway, if you enjoyed this story, please remodel your entire house in the Italian brutalist style. It really helps me with the YouTube algorithm when you do that. There are other things you could consider doing as well, like clicking the like button or subscribing to the channel, but none are as effective as remodeling your house in the style of Italian brutalism, I personally feel. Thank you so much. Have a good week, and until next time, sleep well.